Hello, this is Paul Davis. I am doing this video to present an overview of a book that I've written called Restoring the Fivefold Ministry. This is the second edition of Restoring the Fivefold Ministry. The first edition was published in 2004 and became a Google Scholar book and is in the top 3% of books downloaded from the website Academia edu, which is a website used by higher education throughout the world. The first edition has been downloaded all over the world. This particular book is a second edition, which deals specifically with church leadership, but also deals with what I call avoiding the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome, which is a phrase that I've coined based on my research in founder syndrome and leadership models, and specifically the servant leadership model. So this book will be coming out in the fall of 2019. It's at the publisher now, and it's on its way to being into the bookstores at Amazon and Barnes and Nobles and Ingram and others. So this is Restoring the Fivefold Ministry, second edition. Let me give a quick overview about myself. I'm a apostolic minister with 45 years of ministry in church planting in the Northeast and Southeast. I planted 9 churches. I have a master's in management and leadership from Liberty University. I have a postgraduate educational specialist degree in teaching and curriculum, also from Liberty University. I'm a college professor as well. My doctoral studies are in organizational leadership and human resource management from Regents University, and then I have a master's in Trinity from Trinity Seminary. I teach in the Central Florida area for almost the past 10 years. I've been a professor of writing, business, and psychology in colleges and universities in Central Florida. My interest is in leadership and leadership management, and because of being a minister specifically in church leadership, and this book I am hoping will become a textbook for Bible college because of the significance of the material that's in the book. The quick overview of the chapters: the introduction, chapter 2, so you want to be a preacher. The first megachurch deals, of course, with the founding of the church in the book of Acts and the original church leadership structures. Organizational identity deals with what makes an organization. Christians on the Broadway discusses the concept of denominationalism and why we have so many different denominations, and primarily that's because of the fact that church leadership is at fault when it comes to the many divisions that have happened in the Christian church. The Christian church is actually only one church. It's not a denomination, and the Encyclopedia of Religion includes 33,000 different Christian denominations. The problem with that, of course, is if the Lord had told you what the name of the church had to be, the devil painted a sign and put it on the door. So this deals with the fact that we often judge one another based on our interpretation of scriptures, when we ought to realize that the Christian church includes many denominations. That doesn't mean that everybody preaches the truth, but most denominations do preach the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the biggest problem actually in the church is not false doctrine, it's partial truth. Partial truth can be completely true, but incomplete. And most preachers in every denomination are very sincere in their beliefs, and we should not judge them on that basis. Apollos was fervent in the Spirit, knowing only the baptism of John. And then Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and showed him the way of God more perfectly. But I deal with the situation of denominations and actually the problems of the church today. Some of the reasons why I've written this book is really about the leadership of the church that's caused most of the problems that exist in the church. Church polity is chapter 6, which deals with the different kinds of government, church government that exists, which is Episcopalian, Presbyterian, congregational government, oligarchies, which is ruled by a few. Then you have the single pastor church, which is most common in evangelical churches today. Chapters 7 and 8 deal with the power structures. Because the book talks about servant leadership as the model that Jesus gave us and the model that he intended, we have to understand, where does power exist in a relationship when it comes to leadership. Leadership is not about positional power. It's not about possessions. Leadership is about influence. So you can be a leader and have absolutely no position of authority. So we deal with the power structures. The earliest power structures deals with goes all the way back to Genesis, and the first power structure that came into existence was the headship of the man over the woman. And so a part of this book deals with feminist theology and equality, and this is where I'm sure that I'll raise a firestorm in many ways when I claim within the book that there's no such thing as absolute equality among humankind. Not all people are created equal, and they're not all created the same. They're all created equal as far as the eyes of God is concerned, as far as salvation. But people in poor countries are certainly not born with equal benefits and equal opportunities in countries where there are countries that are industrialized. So you can't claim they were born equal anyway. Perhaps that should be the better term instead of created equal. However, they're not created equal because God is the one that gives gifts, and He does not give the same gifts to every person. So there certainly is differences in people. So I deal with power structures. The concept of feminist theology deals with the role of women, and I have a whole chapter on the ministry of women, and I advocate for the ministry of women because of the fact that the Bible teaches that a woman can have any one of the fivefold gifts. However, I do not believe in women pastors as far as being elders in the church, but I do believe in women pastors as far as being pastors in the church, and that's entirely different. And so we have to, that's one of the reasons why we've written this book, is to help understand the difference between the fivefold gifts of ministry and the concept of elders and deacons, which refers to the church government. Church government and church ministry are basically two different things that have to be discussed and are discussed in this book. Leadership development, Jesus had the hardest and most difficult of leadership development, if you want to call them course or classes or however you want to look at it, his program, his leadership development program. And so I talk about leadership development programs in the current era that goes through different colleges. Most every college has a leadership development program of some kind. Most businesses have some kind of a leadership development program. Jesus' leadership development was the hardest of all because it took committing everything. And commitment is one of the things that I deal with here. And so when I talk about leaders and what makes a leader, several chapters here, the called, chosen, faithful leader, the called leader, the chosen leader, and the faithful leader, all deal with the question, are leaders born or are leaders made? And the answer is yes. So I go through that, showing the process of leadership development and how servant leadership came into existence as the model of Jesus, whose leadership is actually inverted authority. The maladaptive church leadership then gets into the problem that we have today. The biggest problem in church leadership today is the confusion between the differences of church government, which include elders and deacons, and the fivefold ministry, which includes the apostle, prophet, evangelist, and pastor, teacher. So they are different, and we have gotten to the place where we now focus primarily on a single pastor, which is a single gift of the fivefold ministry. And by doing so, we have almost created the death of the fivefold ministry, the demise of the fivefold ministry. And that's one of the main purposes of this book, when it's called Restoring the Fivefold Ministry, is how do we get back understanding the differences between the fivefold gifts and the church model of leadership. The Bible taught a collegial eldership. It did not teach a single pastor church. For example, it says, obey them that have the rule of you, for they are they that must watch for your souls. That's in the plural. Let the elders that rule well be worthy of double honor. That's in the plural. ordain elders in every church, ordain elders in every city. The Bible's very plain that the Lord did not start a church with a single leader. That came about in the 3rd or 4th century when chairmen of the eldership, the elder boards were, they elected a chairman, and the clergy began to develop. But in the Scripture, it was not that way. And the reason why it's so hard today, and the reason why there's so many different denominations and church splits and church abuses and preacher religion, it's all because of the fact that we have lost the understanding of the fivefold ministry and have elevated the one single pastor, which is a maladaptive church leadership. In these chapters, I deal with the Peter, Paul, Apollos syndrome, which is preacher's religion. I deal with the 3 spirits that destroy the church ministry, which is from the book of Job, which is the spirit of Cain, that is the spirit of jealousy, the spirit of Balaam, which is gift for gain, and the spirit of Kor, which is rebellion. These spirits operate within the church and actually influence leadership in negative ways that can create problems within the church. Chapter 15 deals with aborting the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome. A syndrome is a group of symptoms that create a specific behavior or a specific condition. And so the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome is full of different kinds of symbols that support and reinforce the concept of the single pastor church, and that makes it very difficult to work or operate within a fivefold ministry concept that was according to the Scriptures. For example, Pastoral Appreciation Days. That is a symbolic way of reinforcing the single pastor church. And although we need to honor our pastors, we need to understand that the church can have more than one pastor, so they should all be honored. But if you're going to honor the pastor, why don't you honor the apostle? And what about Apostle Appreciation Days and Prophet Appreciation Days and Evangelist Appreciation Days and Teacher Appreciation Days? So we're reinforcing the single pastor concept, which is actually the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome aligns very much with Founder Syndrome, which is a lot of the research that I did in graduate school was on Founder Syndrome, and how Founder Syndrome creates tension for a person to hold on to authority and has centralized authority in the organization that they found. And as the organization grows, the leader does not grow with them because they don't know how to distribute authority or let go of authority. So instead, they do symbolic things to restrict other leaders. Most pastors have had other pastors sitting on the pew, but they're not recognized as pastors or given the position of pastors or given the authority of pastors or are able to operate in a pastoral gift. Usually they just sit on the pew and preach once in a while. The book then goes into the fivefold ministry, awakening fivefold ministry, apostles, prophet, evangelists, pastor, teachers, and then to the ministry of women, and then restoration leadership. I'm going to go quickly just through a couple of quotes because I do not want to make this lengthy. I made another video that is also on YouTube that's more in depth, but just a couple of things that I'll show here. I mentioned the different histories of the rise of the clergy, the single leader of elders, the typology of Moses and elders in church leadership. But I point out that one of the situations that we have to understand about pastoring or church leadership is whose needs are being met. And when the Bible teaches servant leadership, a pastor, apostle, elder, all the ministries and those in leadership within the church were supposed to lead from the role of a servant. And this is what Jesus was teaching when he said, the Gentiles exercise authority over you, but this is not the way it's going to be with you. The person who would be a leader must be a servant. The principle is the principle of service, not the principle of management. How ministers are called, the preacher's worldview. We talked about that a little bit. When we talk about the founding of the church, we realized that there was a great revival in the day of Pentecost. But if we had that kind of revival today, which sometimes in many cases we do, but usually what are the questions that are being asked? The questions are, where did they meet? Did they have multiple meeting schedules? Who was the pastor or evangelist? In other words, so often when you have great revivals, the focus becomes on the personality of the ministry rather than the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. We talk about the church as the oldest organization. Organizational identity deals with the mission, the primary purpose and brand of an organization. With the church itself, the mission, message, ministry, and methods all refer to the structural organization. And if you ever lose the purpose or mission of the church, then you'll lose the church. I cover the topics of preacher wannabes, the entertainer, the philosopher, psychologist, professor, and imitator. Deal with the subject that salvation is a process, and why we have to avoid false judgment, because oftentimes as ministers in particular denominations, we sometimes think, well, the God of the Baptist is not the same God of the Methodists, or the Apostolics worship different God, or the Catholics worship a different God, or whatever the case may be. And so we have to be very careful about making false judgments. However, that does not remove the fact that there is a lot of false doctrine, and the false doctrine is in the church, not just outside of the church. The church itself is one church, and the many denominations that make up the church, it doesn't mean that they all preach the truth, but if they're preaching the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, they're at least preaching partial truth, and that makes them a part of the Church of Jesus Christ. We deal with the different polity. I mentioned that, the different styles of government. When talking about power structures, organizations have vertical and horizontal structures in them, and the configurations of power, and there's even configurations of power and leadership. Merrick notes that possessions, personality, and position in a social structure are interrelated variables that influence the evolution of control, compliance, interaction patterns. This telling comment reveals a great deal about the nature and purpose of power. Why does anyone want to be a leader? This begs the question as to whether leadership equates to power or authority, and does power infer the promised reward, as in greater position or more possessions? Typically, the concept of leadership is enthroned in the notion of status, position, and other personal benefits. I added this: we hypothesize that it's not power that corrupts. It was Lord Aston who made the statement that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I made the comment here that it's not power that corrupts. For example, one of the major themes in the Bible is the power that God gives to the church. It's not power that corrupts, but rather position and possessions, which are a corrupting influence on those that have power. Power without love is the most dangerous form of power, and since love other than for self suggests the opposite of self-interest, power that is non-corrupting can only be power not driven by self-interest. So there's much more to the church. Again, leadership development deals with leadership development programs. I'm mentioning some in Harvard and other places. The power position, who can be a leader? What are the first principles, which is commitment? Commitment is certainly on the downturn in society today, and that makes it more difficult to truly develop leadership. So we deal with commitment, faithfulness in the face of failure. I talk about failures in leadership, including my own, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because of a sad period in my life where I took the attitude, well, bless God, I'm the pastor, it's my way or the highway. Well, I was wrong with that kind of thinking. And when I split the church that God was birthing in that city, a tremendous church, I learned some very hard lessons, both painful, but it caused me to go back to scriptures to try to understand better what does it really mean to pastor a church. So anticipating the meetings of challenges, faithful leader nourishing the soul of leader. Cover in the called, chosen, faithful leader how Jesus is the master leader. What is vision? I quote, for example, John Maxwell in the Maxwell Leadership Bible, a great author on leadership. He talks about 21 qualities of great leaders, and he mentions one of those qualities is the quality of vision. Maxwell states lessons from Abraham on vision, and writes that a vision must be bigger than the leader. Maxwell writes, while Abraham wanted to father an heir, God wanted to father nations. So when I deal with the topics of the called, chosen, and faithful leader, and what is leadership all about, leadership is the one who must who carries the vision and has the vision, and that's why leadership is all about influence. So we deal with the meanings of those things. I also deal with the fact that we overemphasize academic degrees when it comes to leadership. In the Lord's leadership program, you don't have to have a degree to be a called preacher. I'm all for education. That's sharpening your own skills. But what God emphasizes is not academic development, but rather development of character, wisdom, and piety. The three spirits that destroy the church, maladaptive leadership, avoiding the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome. Edelman wrote this in his book on leadership. He says that founder syndrome is a condition which an organization operates primarily according to the personalities of one or more members, usually the founders, rather than according to the organization's missions, policies, and systems. Edelman notes that control systems, lines of authority, budgets, and strategic planning are important elements of an organization, but progress in reaching the organization's potential is impeded when founders fear losing control of these processes. And so the Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome is basically the same thing. When men found a church and birth churches, it's a centralized authority. There's usually only one person, which of course was not the way churches were started in the Bible. They usually were started by apostolic teams. But that doesn't preclude the fact that people do start churches. A couple goes out or a missionary goes out and starts churches. But when you originally start a church or any organization, you have centralized authority. But as the organization grows, there's a need to distribute more authority and power to other people. And that creates a tension for the leader, who begins to feel like they're losing control of their power. And as a result, they begin doing things to reinforce the single pastor concept or the single leader concept, and reinforce this centralized authority. And it becomes self-serving. And so the founder syndrome and the pastoral supremacy syndrome both have this in common. People with those syndromes are usually operating out of fear, not faith, and or they are operating out of self-interest rather than the interest or the mission of the organization. So chapters 17 to 22 deal with the Fivefold Ministry, the hand ministry, apostles for governing, prophets for guiding, evangelists for gathering, pastors for guarding, and teachers for grounding. And then I begin to get into the ministry of women. As I mentioned, I believe in women pastors, but I don't believe in women pastors. And the reason why I say that is there's a difference between the gift of pastoring, which is a spiritual gift that operates within a spiritual nature, and leadership, which operates both in a secular and spiritual nature. It has a different role entirely. The Bible taught elders and deacons as the church government taught the fivefold ministry as the ministry. Elders and deacons usually are equipped with one of those particular gifts. But as I mentioned, if you can have more than one apostle in the church, why can't you have more than one pastor? If you can have more than one prophet, why can't you have more than one pastor? If you can have more than one teacher or evangelist, why can't you have more than one pastor? So this concept that you can only have one church and the pastor, the head of the church, is really missing the point of what fivefold ministry is all about. It's also missing the point because Jesus is the only head of the church. So the idea that anything with two heads is a monster, that may be true, but the church really only has one head. We as ministers, as pastors and elders, leaders, whatever we are under shepherds. We're certainly not the head of the church, and we misunderstand that, and we misunderstand the role of leadership and why it's possible to work in collegial eldership. It's very difficult to do, and I understand that, because you have to be able to work with other leaders and share authority. You have to ask the questions. How do you share the tithes? How do you share the pulpit? How do you share the authority? Those are tough questions to deal with, but this is what the Bible teaches. Women, there were many prophetesses in the scripture, and a woman can have any one of the fivefold gifts. She can be a woman pastor, particularly pastors that deals with the pastoral gift, which is primarily a counseling kind of a gift. And so you can have women pastors, you can have youth pastors, you can have other kinds of pastors. You can have more than one pastor in a church, but people have to be able to operate in the authority and in the gift. And so this is the concern when you have Pastoral Supremacy Syndrome, is the problem of protectionism that develops, preventing the sharing of authority and power and allowing the operation of gifts. Women, however, do not have the authority to be the head of the home or the head of the church. However, they do have the authority to be equal in all other aspects of life. So, I talk quite a bit about that when I deal with feminist theology. And then last of all, the restoration ministry is the reason for restoration, the challenge of restoration, and understanding first among equals. The church had 12 apostles that began the first church, and James was not the first pastor of the church. The Bible said he is one of the pillars. Peter, James, and John were three of the pillars, which indicated they had greater influence in their leadership, perhaps, than the other apostles. But they certainly were equal in authority. They did not have, not one of them had authority over the other. James was not the pastor of Peter. And so, it's very possible then for a church to work with multiple leaders. You just have to believe that it is possible, and understand that this is what the scripture taught and how to go about doing it. So it's all about relationship. And yet when it talks about first among equals, it's also understood that some people will have greater influence than other people, and that's typical for a leadership role. But if you have that kind of influence, do you operate from the perception of being a servant, or do you operate from the perception of being the boss? There's a lot of difference in the attitude of the leader in that condition. So this book is going to be out, Restoring the Fivefold Ministry. Be looking for it in your bookstores. It certainly may hit a few controversial statements there, because it covers a lot of different things: collegial eldership as well as pastoral ministry, and women's ministry, and feminist theology. So that right there can raise several different flags, and you're certainly going to want to see, well, what do I have to say about that? I hope at least be sincere and honest enough to take a look and don't prejudge the discussion. I advocate for women in ministry. I advocate for equality of women in many areas of life. But this is dealing with church leadership and the fivefold ministry. God bless you.